gets out from the female body as the menstrual. Okay, so this normally lasts between 3 to 5 days, but sometimes the flow can go on longer, maybe up to 7 to 9 days. Okay, even though degeneration of the endometrium no longer occurs, but the flow is still there because it's like the end of the menstrual phase. Okay, so after the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase starts to occur. When there is different lengths in proliferative phase, this leads to the different duration of menstrual cycle. Okay, why that is so is because the proliferative phase may be different in each and every one of female individual because of the different how do I say this? Different secretory changes during the proliferative phase. Okay, it normally in a 28-day cycle, it normally lasts for about 10 days. So what is constant is the last phase, which is the secretory phase. Okay, it remains constant for 14 days. This is the basis of the contraceptive method known as the calendar method. Okay, whereby a couple may count down from the beginning of the next cycle. Okay, count down 14 days to actually determine the ovulation cycle of the ovulation stage of the female. Okay, so this can be used as a contraceptive method. Okay, remember we have 3 phases in the endometrial cycle, one being the menstrual phase. Okay, whereby at the same time the new menstrual cycle begins in the ovary. Second is the proliferative phase, which lasts for about 10 days, but different in each and every one of female individual. Third being the secretory phase, which is constant at 14 days. Okay, remember that. So if I mention ovarian cycle, it comes to your mind that it's talking about the hormones. But when I mention endometrial cycle or uterine cycle, it should come to your mind. The first thing that should come to your mind is the changes within the uterine lining. Okay, deal? Okay, let's take at the first phase, which is the menstrual phase. Okay, here we can see the lining of the uterus or the endometrial is very thin. Excuse me. So when there is no fertilization, that means the ovum is released during ovulation, but there's no sperm coming in to fertilize it. There'll be degeneration of the corpus luteum, okay, which means that estrogen and progesterone secretion are very low. Okay, this leads to constriction of the uterine blood vessels. Okay, when the uterine blood vessel starts to constrict, that means oxygen and nutrients will be blocked from reaching the endometrium. Okay. There's also vasoconstriction and uterine contraction because of the low estrogen and progesterone from the regressing corpus luteum. Okay, and the high endometrial prostaglandin being released, and these are the ones that assist vasoconstriction and uterine contraction. Okay, all of this then leads on to the menstrual flow that lasts between 3 to 5 days. Okay, what is released during menstruation are blood in the endometrium. Okay, because you know that the endometrium is heavily supplied with blood vessels, okay, as well as the endometrial debris, which includes tissue, mucus, and epithelial cells within the endometrium. Okay, so that is the menstrual flow. Oh, okay. In this diagram, I forgot to mention that because there's a continuation from one cycle to another. Okay, the menstrual phase can be seen twice in this diagram. So what happens in the proliferative phase? Okay, prior to ovulation, a week prior to ovulation, we know that we have the development of the dominant follicle, which starts to secrete a lot of estrogen. We know that after the menstrual phase, the endometrium will be reduced. The thickness of the endometrium will be reduced because it has been the wall has been sloughed off and taken out of the body. So what happens when there is a lot of estrogen being produced is estrogen will act upon the endometrium cells, okay, as well as on the uterine smooth muscle known as the myometrium, okay, and they start to develop. So thickness of the endometrium starts to increase. Okay. There is also formation of progesterone receptors induced by the presence of estrogen. And prior to ovulation, if you can see in the diagram here, the thickness of the endometrium is about 3 to 5 millimeter. And on top of that, there is mucus secretion. Mucus presence is there to assist in sperm movement. Okay, so prior to ovulation, we know that for fertilization to occur, the sperm needs to move up from the vagina across the uterus into the fallopian tube. Okay, so that is what happens during the proliferative phase of the endometrium cycle. So the next phase is the secretory phase. At this time, remember, prior to ovulation, we have the estrogen that primes the progesterone receptors, that primes the endometrium so that it is very receptive to progesterone. Okay, so at this stage, there is the presence of a lot of progesterone receptors. So at this stage also, after ovulation, we have a lot of progesterone being secreted. And this actually induces endometrium secretion. So we have progesterone as well as estrogen. So the endometrium gland starts to have a lot of glycogen. And this is important because glycogen is the energy source for a healthy pregnancy. Viscosity of mucus in the cervix also is increased, and this is to prevent entry of bacteria. And also, to actually assist in implantation or pregnancy, there is reduced myometrium contraction. Okay, 1 week after ovulation would be peak of secretory phase. Endometrium is between 5 to 6 millimeter, which means that it is ready for implantation. Okay, so at this stage. Okay, now let's take a look at the summary of the menstrual cycle. I think I can leave you with the changes, the major events or summary of the menstrual cycle, but let's take a look at the graphs. We know that at the beginning of the follicular phase, inhibition on FSH is uplifted. So FSH is being secreted it will start to be secreted, and this FSH then goes on to stimulates the development of several follicles, okay, up to between 10 to 25 follicles. But then when the follicles, the dominant follicles is selected, it starts to secrete a lot of estrogen, okay, and at this stage, FSH secretion and LH secretion are being inhibited. Okay, that means at very high concentration of estrogen, it has negative feedback effects upon LH and FSH. Okay, so nearing to ovulation, somehow estrogen secretion is very, very high. It reaches its peak level. And this peak level, instead of having a negative feedback effect on LH and FSH, instead it has a positive feedback effect, okay, on LH and FSH, because LH and FSH are very important to assist ovulation to occur to assist ovulation, and then also in assisting the formation of the corpus luteum. Okay, then corpus luteum has endocrine function, which means that it starts to secrete both estrogen and progesterone, and at this level, progesterone and estrogen have inhibitory effect upon secretion of both LH and FSH. Okay, but if there is no fertilization and there's no implantation, that means this corpus luteum will then transform into corpus albicans, having no endocrine function. Thus, having no endocrine function, that means there's no estrogen. So estrogen is at a very low level, and this actually lifts the inhibition on FSH, and a new cycle begins. Okay, so you can see here, you have to remember that at very low concentration, estrogen, there's a very low concentration of estrogen in the beginning of the menstrual cycle, FSH will be secreted, and this then goes on to induce the formation of follicles. But once the dominant follicles is selected, very high level of estrogen will then inhibit, rising, not very high, rising level of estrogen will inhibit the secretion of LH and FSH. But just prior to ovulation, very, very high estrogen level will have positive feedback effect upon both LH and FSH. This leads to ovulation as well as the formation of the corpus luteum having endocrine function. Okay, and this corpus luteum then goes on to produce estrogen as well as progesterone, and both of these have negative feedback effect upon LH and FSH. Okay, but upon being transformed to corpus albicans, it doesn't have any endocrine function, and with no estrogen, FSH starts to be secreted and a new cycle begins. Okay, remember that? Rising levels of estrogen has negative feedback effect upon FSH and LH, but very high level of estrogen has positive effect upon LH and FSH secretions. Okay. Let's stop and start again at 12:30.